greetings from Planet Washington. Our national chapter sends their greetings to the board and wants you to know how appreciative they are of the work of this chapter. In fact, we're proud of all our chapters, and we know that InfraGard is a grassroots organization, and without the work of the boots on the ground, we wouldn't have an effective organization. And we also, of course, always take an opportunity to thank the FBI for their long-standing support for our program. So we have a modest crowd today, and I'm reminded actually, excuse me, I've got a little bit of a cold, but I'm reminded of a discussion I had just 2 weeks ago with an elderly priest who teaches at my daughter's Catholic school down in Washington. And he mentioned that when he was just graduated from the seminary, he was posted to a church in a small farming community in Idaho. The long-standing priest there had passed away, and so that was his first parish. And he arrived, was preparing for his first sermon on the Sunday after his arrival, and he was a bit nervous. He said, you know, he'd never done it before other than in practice. And so he worked very hard to put together what he thought was a very meaningful, wonderful sermon. And so Sunday came around, and he got up at the pulpit and waited for the crowd to come in, and the farmer came in with muddy boots and sat in the first row. And he waited 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes. No one else showed up. And so he looked at the farmer and said, "Sir, it appears that you're going to be the only parishioner today. Come, should I go ahead and give my sermon?" And the farmer just nodded yes. So he gave a sermon. It was full of fire and brimstone. He was very proud of himself, and over the course of the next hour, he really, in his judgment, gave one of the finest sermons that in the latter years he couldn't compare it to what he's done since. And at the end, he got down from the pulpit and went and sat next to that farmer, and he said, "Look, sir, you know, this is my first time today, and I'm very appreciative you showed up, and I'd like to ask you, how do you think I did?" And the farmer said, "Well, you know, if I took my pickup truck full of hay out to the field to feed the cows, and only one cow showed up, I sure wouldn't give him the whole load." So I guess I'm not going to give you my 83 PowerPoint slides today. I hope that we can have a brief presentation and then some good interaction between us, and perhaps talk a little bit about a subject that's very dear to my heart, and that is transparency, accountability, and reputation management. Before I begin, let me just say that you may already know from my accent, I am a New Yorker. I graduated from John Jay College, and I'm going to date myself because when I went to John Jay, it was co-located with the New York City Police Academy. That's how far back that was. You all work very hard to secure the assets of your companies, whether they be physical assets or information assets. But think about this. We know what a computer intrusion might eventually lead to, the cost, the embarrassment. But in today's highly regulated environment, a violation of a rule, a law, or a regulation could cost the company a great deal more than any security breach, be it a computer breach, or breach of its physical assets, or even a physical attack. We've seen this time and time again. At the end of my speech, I was going to say the following phrase, or make the following comment. I'll do it at the beginning, and that is, it's far easier to keep your reputation than to recover it. And there are many companies that have found that out the hard way. Enron, WorldCom, Arthur Andersen. However, there are companies that have violated laws systematically, who have recovered their reputation. And I want to talk a little bit about how they did that, how they differentiated themselves from the ones that were never able to recover. Specifically, I'll talk to you about a recent case involving one of the largest corporations in the world, Siemens. And as a way of my own disclosure, I was appointed as the independent compliance advisor to the board of directors of Siemens in 2007, right after the newspapers disclosed that Siemens had been involved in a bribery scheme, bribing foreign officials to obtain business overseas. And this is, to date, the largest bribery scandal in the history of the world, corporate world. In the end, we found Siemens, over the course of 10 years, had paid 4,000 bribes for a total of $1.8 billion. So, at the beginning, before I even became involved, the first reaction by the executives of Siemens, the chairman of the supervisory board, the CEO of Siemens, was to say this was a small group of individuals who really didn't follow our rules and our guidelines. This was not a systematic problem. They did what a lot of companies tried to do at the beginning of the scandal. And whether the scandal is insider trading or Foreign Corrupt Practices Act or an environmental issue like BP recently experienced in the Gulf, they circle the wagons. They try to protect themselves. They try to protect their image. And in some cases, they go on the offensive and attack the regulators or the prosecutors. We've learned from experience, particularly if you work in the area of crisis communications, that that's the worst thing you can do. Until you know what the facts are, and the sooner you learn those facts, the better off. You shouldn't be out there being defensive. From day one, you've got to explain to the public, and through the public, to the prosecutors, regulators, that you're going to get to the bottom of this. You're going to cooperate, and you're going to make sure whatever happened doesn't happen again. Now, in Siemens' case, 1999 was an important year because that's the year that they listed on the New York Stock Exchange. Siemens, if you don't know, is a company with 400,000 employees operating in 180 countries around the world with revenues of about $130 billion. They're like a General Electric, one of the largest corporations in Europe and the world. And they have a history going back 150 years, very proud history. In 1999, they listed on the New York Stock Exchange. And that brought them under the rules and scrutiny of the Securities and Exchange Commission that made them subject to a number of different laws like Sarbanes-Oxley. That very same year, or the year before, the OECD passed a treaty that's very similar to our Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. It's a treaty that was signed by Germany as well as the other 44 OECD nations that prohibited their companies from bribing foreign officials to obtain or retain business. In 1999, what we later learned was that Siemens, actually let me tell you a quick story, because I got called in 1999 by the president of Siemens and asked to go to Germany and give a lecture to the top 30 executives of Siemens about their new responsibilities as a public company and under the OECD anti-bribery convention. And I went there and I spent 2 hours explaining what the FCPA is, what the new OECD treaty is, and after those 2 hours, I asked if there were any questions. Not one question from the 30 top executives of the company. Subsequently, 12 of those executives went to jail. So remember that when I ask for questions later.
What'd you say?
What we found at Siemens was that the corruption was deep and systematic, and it was done with not only management knowledge, but management approval and participation. Siemens wound up paying $1.5 billion in fines. They were disbarred from doing business with the World Bank for several years because of corruption from World Bank funded projects. A number of their executives were convicted. They are under a court-imposed monitor for a period of 3 years. But Siemens has turned their reputation around and really become a model for compliance and governance. And I want to tell you a little bit about how they did that, how they took the worst scandal in history, Foreign Corrupt Practices Act scandal in history, and within a short period of 2.5 years, became model citizens. So much so that the Attorney General of the United States has praised their program as being a model, as have other ministers of justice and attorney generals from around the world. First and foremost, of course, please have a seat. First and foremost, Siemens created a new compliance program. I assisted them with that, as did my company and my team. We put in place new internal rules. We set a new tone from the top. We did training of all employees on their obligations, ethical obligations, their obligations in financial reporting for transparency and accountability. Put in, of course, a hotline, which they frankly should have had in 1999 for whistleblowers, and I want to come back to that issue of whistleblowers in light of the recent SEC expansion. Actually, I will say this, the SEC's new whistleblower rules turn whistleblowers into mercenaries. Because traditionally, a whistleblower is supposed to report misconduct to management. And that person doesn't become a whistleblower until management fails to take action on the issues that that person has raised. Then that person can go outside and report it to other authorities. In the case of the new SEC rules, the whistleblower does not have to report it internally. They can go outside immediately. In the first case under this new rule, a whistleblower was awarded $98 million because of a fine imposed on Pfizer. So you've probably all read now that the SEC has said that it's receiving about 30 new whistleblower complaints every day. This is why when I'm talking about this reputation management is so important today, because it's unlikely that any firm is going to escape this oversight. So in Siemens' case, we put into place everything they should have had. We put into place checks and balances, internal audits. We put in place a new enterprise risk management system. But the thing that we did that made the most difference is early on, we began an outreach program to NGOs around the world who are involved in anti-corruption work, transparency and accountability work. Now Siemens, when I first talked to them about outreach, said, well, we can't do that. Why? Well, because people will think we're hypocritical. They'll look at us with skepticism. We've just been accused of bribing, paying $1.8 billion in bribes, and all of a sudden we're going to become a member of the anti-corruption movement. And I said, well, look, people are going to look at you with skepticism tomorrow or 3 years from now or 5 years from now. The sooner you get started,